The scripture reading this morning comes from a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a town called Colossae. It was very close in proximity to Ephesus. And what you need to understand is that when you read Paul's letters, I don't know about you, but honestly, it doesn't matter which translation you use. Sometimes the things that he says, it leaves your head scratching, like it almost sounds like it's on a whole nother level, right? It sounds very philosophical in nature. But here's the thing you got to understand, that there is a broader context in which Paul is writing, and this is one of those examples. It's a mouthful. In fact, it's more than a mouthful, the things that he says. But here's the thing. To understand why Paul writes this, why he uses this language, why he uses certain phrases and actually connects certain phrases, he does this very, very intentionally. Okay, Paul was a mastermind when it came to writing into and speaking into a very complex world and culture and situation. This church, or these Christians in Colossae, this area, this region was among the regions where this belief system was beginning to develop in tandem with Christianity and really a conglomerate of other philosophies and other religions. And we look at that and refer to it as Gnosticism. But when Paul's writing this letter, during this time, Gnosticism is really in its infant state. Okay, it really isn't become a full-thrown movement. It doesn't have a lot of throttle behind it. In fact, depending upon your location and where you go, there's different flavors of what we refer to today as Gnosticism. This is not necessarily what they would refer to it back during that time, but in different areas and different locations, there was just belief. And this belief was fundamentally speaking, it basically said physical things in this world was like yuck. That's about the best we can go. Like, seriously, the way that they looked at things, they looked at life, they looked at physical things, the material things, essentially it was just really icky and gooey and slimy. And that was their perspective of it, okay? And what they did in this particular area was it also had flavors of Judaism kind of wrapped up into this belief that there is a God, okay, and that Jesus was a real person, a real man, or some said he wasn't a real man. It was more of like a ghost that what you were seeing. It wasn't really a physical thing. It was more like a mirage of sorts. There's a bunch of different flavors about what this looked like and how they came to terms of understanding this. But if you follow the implications of the physical being inherently bad and evil, okay, it ultimately leads you to certain conclusions. And those conclusions were that God would not intervene into this fleshly, inherently evil, yucky, material world, which would ultimately lead to Jesus. Well, you could take the different paths. Either he really didn't come in the flesh, or he really wasn't God, or if he really was God in the flesh, it was more of a mirage. And like he came at one point, but right before he died, he left, or he didn't come until the death. There's tons of complicated conclusions that people will come to. That is what Paul is trying to speak into. That is what Paul is dealing with in this particular letter that he writes to the people in Colossae we refer to as Colossians. Now, here's the thing. When they looked at the world and they looked at their own philosophy, they looked at this religion referred to as the way, and then they looked at, you had influences from Judaism and influences from other places as well. Colossae was a very Gentile, lots of people coming from pagan religions, pagan backgrounds. They essentially believed this: people were conceived in brute passion, born in blood, lived in pain, and died in ignorance, again dissolving into slime. Not my words, their words, okay? That was their outlook, that was their perspective. Now, over the years, this movement kind of begins to develop, and you see in history, especially within the 2nd century, a full-blown attack. But then you also have the church that comes with a full-blown offense, okay, to denounce and to explain and to show or demonstrate the reality of the gospel message and the real presence of Jesus, of God on earth in the flesh. And then you had lots of debates and lots of writings that went out to debunk or to denounce the Gnosticism that really had begun to develop and take a stronghold within various cultures, okay? But that's the situation that Paul is writing into here. That's why he uses the various language that he does. And essentially what he is trying to get across, okay, in his writings and the phrases that he uses is this. You think that this world is so evil and so bad, and the flesh and the material things are so wicked that God, a pure and holy God, would not even think about coming into this inherently evil and wicked, materialistic, physical thing. And Paul says to the contrary. No, yes, there is tons of evil, right? There's tons of wickedness in this world. It is in a fallen and a broken state. But here's the thing. God, being as holy and as pure and as just as he was, did break into time in a physical, material way. And in doing so, demonstrating God in the flesh, that he might gather to himself a people. We call that the church. People from all generations, from all nationalities and all races and all cultures, gathered together in one place called the ecclesia, the gathering community of God's people. Paul says that's why he came and that's what he did, which is why he says, Colossians beginning in verse 21 of chapter 1. And you, speaking to the readers of this letter, these were Gentiles predominantly, very pagan backgrounds. He says, you who once were alienated. This word in the Greek literally means estranged, a non-participant with God. There's no connection. From their perspective, there was no connection with God. Can you imagine that for just a moment? I want you to think about your life without God. Now, you know what it was like before you committed, before you became a dedicated disciple. But imagine what it would be like now as a non-participant, an alien, when it comes to relationship with God. Imagine what that would be like. We see what it's like and the consequences of that from many perspectives in our world. But as someone who is determined to be a disciple, or at least someone who calls themselves a Christian, a disciple, a follower of Jesus, who sees themselves as being what we refer to as saved. Imagine your life without God. Or imagine the possibility that you're a non-participant. He says, you who once were alienated, estranged, a non-participant. You were alienated and hostile, he says, and hostile in mind. Hostile is a Greek word that literally means adversary. You're an enemy of God. How am I an enemy of God? In the mind, he says. You were hostile in the mind. You were hostile. You were an enemy of God, a non-participant with God. And I love this because Paul actually gets to the root of the issue here. He doesn't just start talking about their deeds, whether they stole or they lied or they committed sexual, they follow after their sexual desires or they took them to the very end. He says here, you were an enemy of God. You were considered a non-participant. Why? Because you were an enemy in the mind. That is, in your understanding, in your attitudes, in your thoughts. He gets to the core, the root of why they lived the way that they lived. Why they were considered what we call pagans. Why they were Gentiles in the flesh, living according to the flesh. He says it's because your mind, in your thoughts, and in your attitude, you were hostile towards God, doing As a result of that, evil deeds, in other words, their deeds illustrated the fact that they were alienated from God. There was no relationship there. There was no connection there whatsoever. There was no moral compass that came from, or that they weren't being driven by their faith to live in a certain way. They had no love for a God that is love. And as a result, their lives demonstrated that very thing. And you once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. In other words, their mind was so set on the flesh. They were so self-absorbed that they were hostile to God. It reminds me of those that Paul talks about in his letter to the Romans in chapter 1, verse 32. He says, they not only do those things that are hostile towards God, or that demonstrate non-participation, a lack of relationship with God, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. That's those Christians in Colossae. That's who they used to be. And he says, you once were this, and even though that was the case, you have been reconciled. Here's the thing. When we are separated from God, we will live a life that illustrates that separation. When we are connected to God, when there is a connection there, our lives will illustrate the very fact that there is a connection, regardless of what we claim. Let me say that again. When there is a separation between us and God, when we live our lives separate from God, even if we claim to be Christians, our lives will illustrate that separation. But when there is a connection, when there is a relationship, and we're focused on working on building and strengthening our faith through that relationship, and our trust begins to run deep, and we consider ourselves literally walking hand in hand with God in His presence, when there is a connection, our life will illustrate that connection. He says, you once were this. You once were cut off, estranged, a non-participant, but now you have been reconciled back to God. That's why he says in verse 22, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. Why couldn't he just say he died for you, right? No, he says he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. He has to overemphasize the physical and the material because of the Gnostic persuasion. He emphasizes this. He says he's now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. I love the fact that he emphasizes the physical nature, and he has to do this for a reason, because in doing so, he notices, he says, it is the place where the flesh and spiritual become one. The flesh becomes spiritual. If God, and that's the conclusion that we have to come to. And the Gnostics knew this, which is what, and they couldn't fathom that happening, and so it drove them in a completely different direction. But Paul says, no. By God coming in the flesh does become spiritual, making the physical like a channel of grace, which is why Jesus says, you be as your Father is, full of grace. You love as your Father loves. But the interesting word that he uses here, and I like this idea, and this is what we want to kind of sit for a moment this morning. Notice he says, listen, you once were a non-participant, estranged. You were over here. But now he has reconciled you, and in that reconciliation, the implication is what? In our hearts, in our minds, in our thoughts, in our attitudes, we are connected trying to come in line with the way that God is and his thoughts and his attitudes and his hearts towards life and towards certain things and towards ourselves and towards other people. And that happens as a result of a relationship that is worked upon. It is a process. It is a journey, and it doesn't happen overnight. But he says that reconciliation now is driving you in a certain direction. He has reconciled you in his flesh, in his body. Why? So he can present you. That word present there can simply just mean to be introduced, or to introduce someone or introduce you. But here's the thing. It's a word that also is used in the sense of a sacrifice being presented. Now here's the thing is this. God does not need to be introduced to us. We were introduced to God. And the way that Paul uses this word is always, it seems to be at least, always in the sense of an offering being presented. So think about this. Just as the priests, whether Jew or Gentile, the Gentiles understood what it was like to be pagan and offer sacrifices. And there were certain regulations on their sacrifices that they offered as well. The Jews didn't have it sewed up. They weren't the only ones who did this stuff. But just as priests would take special attention to make sure that the offerings, the sacrifice was presented as pure and holy and blameless. I love this. We too are being presented as holy and spotless, beyond any charge, guilt, or accusation. The question is, what are we presenting to God? What are we presenting to our families, to our friends, and to our co-workers? What are we presenting? Paul says, present yourself as a living sacrifice. What are we presenting? When we say one thing, what do our actions speak? So if you're sitting next to your spouse, and you claim to be a disciple, and you claim that you're someone who's following Jesus, who wants to follow Jesus. And if I asked you, okay, so are you faithful? Are you faithful? When I say faithful, I don't mean perfect. I mean, are you faithful? Faithful to the journey, to getting up when you fall down, to admitting to your mistakes, to striving and struggling at times, right? To work on developing a better relationship with God so that your relationships will benefit. If I asked you that question, what would your spouse say? What would your family say? What would your friends and your coworkers say? If I asked you, are you faithful? And you said yes, would your spouse or your friends, your coworkers think otherwise? What would they think? So what do we offer? See, here's the thing. It's an amazing thing that God came into the flesh, right, so that he might gather together all nations to present them holy and blameless, as a priest does in a sacrifice. Holy and blameless, present us this way. And the question is, what are we presenting? What are we illustrating? Because here's the thing. That presentation, as a pure presentation, is contingent. Yeah, it is. I really wish it wasn't. But it is. And that's why Paul says this. Look, notice. Look what he says. Verse 23. If. In other words, you used to be this way. But because of his efforts, you are now this way. You've been reconciled. And he's done this so he can present you as a pure and holy and blameless, without accusation or guilt. And he will do that if I don't think we like the word if. I hear the way that we talk, and sometimes I think we swing the pendulum all the way on the other side and act like as if we have nothing to do with the process of sanctification. Sanctification, understanding that is the process of us being transformed into the image of Jesus. If you will be presented, we will be presented, if, he says, look, you continue in the faith. You continue in the faith. The faith is not something that is put up on a bookshelf. It is not something you stick in your pocket. The language here has everything to do with the very same concepts that Paul uses by putting on Jesus. You clothe yourselves with Jesus so that when the world sees you, they see Jesus, right? And we're not perfect at it. We struggle at it, right? But the effort is there because we're holding on. It's like taking a coat and wrapping it around yourself and walking outside, and it's rainy and it's windy. And sometimes you got to hold on to that coat or it's going to go, right? Yeah. Sometimes that's the way that life is. But here's the thing. He says, listen, your presentation is contingent upon you remaining in the faith. And we know what faith looks like. We have the great cloud of witnesses. We have the stories. We have those things that Cullen mentioned earlier. He says you got to remain in the faith. Stable and steadfast. It has everything to do with a foundation. Like a foundation of a house or of a building. And we know what happens, right, when the foundations aren't good. Or when they have to be worked on, what happens? All sorts of damage, all sorts of collateral damage, right? North Point, we know, right? We know what it's like to have a house that has foundation issues, a house that just steadily sinks every day, right? We see that, and you can't fix it because I think there's like a prehistoric river flowing underneath it. And that's true. That's probably true. We understand that he says, listen, you have to remain in the faith, a faith that regardless if you're by the rivers, the waters of life, right, where soil moves, you do not move. Stable and steadfast, not shifting. Here's the thing. Not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. You got to get this. Our pure presentation is contingent upon us being unmoving, us remaining in the faith, being unmovable. And if we move, get it, it is like spiritual treason. It is a sellout. It's a betrayal of Christ. And that's the message that he's trying to get across to these Christians who are being influenced by this, what we refer to as Gnostic beliefs. The secret knowledge of salvation. That's what they believed. Being saved, well, it was a secret and it had to be divinely imparted to you. And those who had the secret, it was like a code. You become part of the group, you can get in, but there are different flavors, different regulations, different laws, different rules. Many of them, especially those in Colossae, seems to be that they held to holding on to the regulations of the law. Regulations on circumcision, regulations on feast days, and so forth. So it had a very strong Jewish element. They had a secret knowledge. And if you go to that, he says it's a betrayal of the physical and spiritual nature of salvation. Divine grace became physical so that we could be reconciled. And by moving away from that, by not remaining in the faith, we literally go back to the way we used to be. Like as if we're alienated and hostile and non-participants with God. That relationship has been severed. We ourselves sever it. In our hearts and our thoughts and our understandings and our attitudes, we move away from being and living and acting and responding the way that God wants us to respond. And sometimes we do that because we just get tired, right? Have you ever got tired of being a Christian or trying to work to become the person that you want to be? Well, sometimes I think it has to do with our belief about how that comes about, because it's not just about our efforts. God does the transforming. But have you ever gotten tired and just given up? I know plenty of people, I've done it myself, where I just could not get it right. I felt like I just could not get it right. Now, my feeling like I could not get it right was based on certain standards that, well, come to learn later in life, were, well, standards that should not have been there. But sometimes we just get tired. Sometimes we get discouraged, right? But here's the thing. Just because we get tired, we get discouraged, bad things happen, right? The world just seems like it's spinning out of control and things never seem to go right for you. Doesn't mean, right? Just because we have those struggles, it doesn't mean that we can let go of, or that we should let go of the hope of the gospel that we heard. And that hope is what? Well, ultimately we could sum it up that it's in God's hands. It's in God's hands. All things work together for the good of those who love him. That either means something or it doesn't. At the end of the day, we don't know what the conclusions are. We don't know why certain things happen. We don't even know if there's a reason. Sometimes, guess what? There isn't a reason. Sometimes it just happens. But we get discouraged and we lose hope. And so for the next couple minutes, I want us to talk about a few little things here that cause us to at least feel like we're losing hope. And if you feel like you're in one of these categories, I want you to listen up. Maybe you know someone who may feel like they're in one of these categories. Or maybe this is one of the reasons why this is connected to why they feel the way that they feel. Listen up. 4 reasons why I believe we feel like we're losing hope at times. Number 1, there was a lack of hope from the beginning. If we experience neglect and we're never nourished as children, which is a real thing, we may never have developed a healthy level of hopeful thinking. Some people, you know those people who walk around, they're negative about everything. They say they're being real. Well, let's just get real. No, you're being negative. You're always looking at the bad side of things. And I think sometimes you have to have those people, right? There's that good tension that brings that to the picture. But let's just face it, we're pendulum swingers, and we'll swing all the way to one end that makes us feel the most comfortable. You know those people. If that's the case, we might not have the confidence and resilience set in place and simply struggle when things prevent us from achieving our goals. And these could be small things, right? Just little, even the spiritual goals. For instance, you determine that every morning you're going to get up and you're going to say a prayer. But then things seem to happen, or for some reason, while things are going good, something happens. And it could be real, it could be imaginative, it could be just in your own mind. You don't have the fortitude to stick with it. And then all of a sudden what happens? You feel like a failure. Maybe you're trying to overcome an addiction and you fall. And all of a sudden you feel like a failure. Like you will never amount to it, that you'll never get over it, that it'll be something you'll never, ever, ever break free from. Well, that's a lack of hope. And sometimes it's a result of our upbringing. Sometimes it has to do with how we were raised, and that's a reality. Number 2, sometimes we feel like we're losing hope because there's a loss of connections. When we experience loss over time, we can start to feel hopeless. Loss can come from divorce, a death, a change. We can also experience loss of intangibles like a job or other important aspects of our identity. When we hold on and wallow in our own grief from these losses, hopelessness can set in. And sometimes we just don't get over them. Sometimes we get locked into the process of grieving. Number 3, victimization. Victimization makes us feel like we're losing hope. When we are abused and belittled, we can start to believe that this is how life is supposed to be. We can begin to feel that we don't have any control over what happens to us and that bad things will always occur. This can relate to unfair treatment from prejudice and discrimination. Number 4, burnout. I've talked about this a lot. Burnout, it's a real thing. If we don't take care of ourselves, we can get exhausted and overwhelmed to a point where life seems to run over us. We no longer feel able to manage our responsibilities. We develop a very negative and cynical view of the world and others. Burnout can lead us to feel defeated. So what does all that have to do with our relationship with God? Because when we experience these things, it gives us a certain perspective and a certain outlook on life. And oftentimes, unfortunately, because we're not working on that relationship with God, our relationship with God is the first thing to go when we feel a loss, when we feel hopeless, when we feel victimized. And that should not be the case. So what do we do? What can we do? If we feel like we're losing hope, what's the solution? What do we do? Well, here it is. You need to seek and you need to set. You need to seek and you need to set. No matter what life throws at you, no matter the situation, no matter your problems, from in the midst of your brokenness, you need to seek and set. You need to keep looking up to Jesus. Notice what I mean by this. Colossians 3, 1, 2, and 3. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek. If you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Seek. We know what seeking is, right? You lose a child, you begin to look for them. You seek after them, right? If you lost your job, you begin to seek after that new employment or a new job. If you want a girlfriend, if you want a spouse, what do? You begin to seek after. We know what that looks like. We know what that means. And so if we feel like we're losing hope, and we feel hopeless, if we know that our relationship with God is not where it needs to be, it's time for us to stop and to begin to seek after Him, to regain the hope that was in the message that we said, I believe, I want to follow. He says, you seek the things that are above. Set your mind, set. You seek it, and when you find it, you set on it, right? That's what I did. My wife and I met. She was on vacation. I was living in Florida. I still can't figure out how she got me to move to Texas. And in Waco, of all places. Waco. And I met her. And I sought her. And a year later, I called her. It took a year. Her cousin wouldn't give me her number. That's a whole nother story. We know what it's like to seek and to set. I set my heart on marrying her. Therefore, I worked 2 full-time jobs, and I moved to Texas. I still can't understand that. You seek and you set. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on the things that are on the earth. All those mindless distractions that tend to zap us of the hope and the thrill of the faith that we first believed and obeyed. Remain in the faith. Set and seek to get in the faith. Back in the faith. For, he says, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. If you're losing hope, if you feel like you're losing hope, maybe it's at work, maybe you feel like you're just not making progress at work, maybe you feel like you're just not going to go anywhere, or maybe you work in a very toxic environment and you feel like you're losing hope. Maybe it's in the home, maybe you feel like you're losing hope with that relationship, maybe you think that marriage is not going to end up working out, maybe you feel hopeless with your kids, you don't know what in the world to do. Go ask your parents, they'll tell you what to do. If you feel like you're losing hope, maybe you feel like you're losing hope with your friends, or maybe with Christianity, right? Maybe you feel like you're losing hope with the world, and it just would be so much easier for you to just to mind your own business and not worry about anything else and to live in your own little fairy tale bubble. Maybe you feel that way, and there's lots of reasons why we could feel that way. My advice to you is to seek and to set. Seek Jesus. And set your mind and your heart on Him so that your thoughts and your understandings and your attitudes will be transformed into His thoughts, His attitudes, His hearts. If you feel like you're losing hope, seek and set your eyes and your hearts on Jesus. You were once a non-participant, but not anymore. You've been reconciled. You've been reconciled. And He will present you as a pure and holy presentation if if you remain in the faith. Remaining in the faith goes beyond just words. It gets down to the heart. The process of transformation. The question is, are we going to seek? Or are we going to set? Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would remove all distractions from our minds. As we go about our days, we deal with real, tangible, physical, material situations, things that affect us. Too many times, Father, I feel like we have a tendency to put aside what we refer to as the spiritual. Because it's so much easier to handle and deal with life and situations the way that we want to, which isn't necessarily always Christ-like. I pray that in this moment that you would give us strength, that you will renew and fill our cups. May our hope come pouring out as we seek and set our minds and our hearts on you in every situation. May this place not be the only place we feel a connection with you. May this place be not the only place where we talk about you, where we focus on you, where we talk to you, where we communicate with you, where we fellowship and commune with you. May this place not be the place where we live in faith. May this be the place where we come to reunite and encourage and uplift and to worship and to glorify you. That gives us the strength so that we go each and every day encouraging, worshiping, glorifying you. Give us the strength to remain in the faith regardless of what happens in this world. Remove the distractions. Allow us to lift our eyes and set our hearts on you. It's in Jesus' name we pray.